Well, good evening. Welcome to Center Stage at Beth Israel, the West Temple. We're very lucky to have this evening a friend of mine, Dr. Trent Brown. Good evening.
Good evening.
How long have you been known as Dr. Trent Brown?
Roughly 2 months.
Tell us what the doctor, the Ph.D. was in, sir.
I was a Doctorate of Management in Criminal Justice.
And what does that mean in the longer version?
Well, the longer version is you learn about leadership skills, management skills, and you learn how to apply them in today's criminal justice system.
Wow. And are there other Ph.D.s in your family?
There's one Ph.D. in my family, and that's my father. So if we jump way back to when my dad was born, he was of 10 brothers and sisters. He grew up in a very small rural town. His mom and dad, mom died when he was 5, dad died when he was 7.
Wow.
So he was basically bounced around from foster home to foster home to foster home until he became, I think it was when he got to high school, he finally latched onto a family that took him in and basically took care of him. But all the other brothers and sisters kind of split up. So my dad saw his way of getting out of this small little town was by getting an education. He went to school. He then joined the Army to get the GI Bill to help him pay for school. And then once he got out of the Army, he came back just for that summer, and he went to work in the oil field. And once that summer was done, he went off to school, and his foster parents were actually very upset with him because he was making very good money in the oil field. And they're like, "What are you doing? This is like a dream job. Why would you want to leave?" He goes, "Well, this isn't what I want to do with my life."
Wow.
So he went to Southern Illinois University. He got his bachelor's degree. He then went to Miami University of Ohio and got his, I believe his master's degree. That's where he met my mom. And then he went to Ohio State and he got his Ph.D. in business. And he was a marketing professor at Wright State for probably 35 years. He did consulting throughout that whole time.
Wow.
And for me, I'm also a teacher on top of a law enforcement officer, but that's I wasn't thinking too much about teaching until about 2005. And then in 2005, ITT, which is a local college, it actually was a national college at the time, but they brought me in because I was a master evidence technician. So I'd go to the crime scenes and things like that. So they wanted somebody that had the ability to teach, just these entry-level classes, but that also had this background. And then from there, I branched out. I eventually got my master's degree from Tiffin University through the FOP scholarship. They basically paid for half of my degree. And then that was right around 2014 when I graduated from there. And then ITT folded. I then went on to work for 2 different universities where now I work for American and Intercontinental University online, which is their base is out of Illinois, and they have another on-site place in Atlanta. I've taught for them since 2014. I think I'm up to 14 different classes I'll teach for them. So then continuing on, when eventually they have a program called the NEAP program, NEAP, which is basically they will sponsor you to get your doctorate if you've been with the school for at least 1 year. And I'd been with them for 5 years at that point, and they said, I applied for this. Basically, it's a scholarship, and I was approved to go into it, and then I entered into this.
Wow.
For Colorado Technical University, which is a sister school of American Intercontinental University. And then, so it's a 3-year process, and I learned an incredible amount of information, things that opened my eyes that, what I found being a police officer I've been with a local agency since 1998. I was hired here. And being a police officer, you encounter things, you deal with things on a daily basis that a lot of people don't see. So you can sometimes be kind of blinded by how the other side's looking in and viewing you. And I found going through this doctorate, it really helped me to open up and see that other side that I wasn't fully aware of. And that's just the honest, I wasn't fully aware of how the other side, how the community looked at the police. And that really came to light, I think, right around 2014 with the Ferguson incident. I know I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but
it's okay.
With the Ferguson incident, when Michael Brown was killed, there was a large riot that happened after the shooting, after he was an unarmed black man that was killed by a white police officer. So there was a riot that took place after that. And looking at how the encounter went down, you're looking at the logistics, the technical side of it, and the police officers look and go, well, you know, how the officer reacted in that situation, it might seem like it was justified. However, you look at the Justice Department came in and did basically an internal audit of Ferguson and their criminal justice system. And they really wanted to see, why was there such a response to this incident? And what they found was that there was, the city of Ferguson was actually, they were actually using the criminal justice system as a way of making money. So they're looking at it as terms of tickets, keeping people on warrants. So it was almost an oppressive type of government, but it wasn't just the police department, it was the courts, and it was City Hall that was actually doing everything in order to basically generate money, which isn't what the criminal justice system is supposed to be about. So it was through that class, Dr. Howe, who was the instructor, that it really opened my eyes to say, well, hey, maybe I should be taking it from a different, you know, instead of having this perspective of the police officer, have that both sides of the vision, I guess, and being able to see what other people see. And I think that's really what has helped me to, I guess, become a better police officer. And I think that's what a lot of officers need to do, is be able to take that look from the community inward, especially with how, you know, the interest in law enforcement and how much it's gone down. So if we jump, I don't want to jump ahead.
So we have a suburb of St. Louis, and we have conduct of a police officer, and in the environment that we were operating in then, which we certainly have now, of the idea of instant media,
Mm-hmm.
instant coverage, instant opinions, instant expertise.
Yes.
This is probably the ultimate question, so we'll get it out of the way early and probably come back to it throughout this hour. That had to have an effect upon a working patrol officer in every community. Fair?
Sure, yeah. And I think so too, because when you see the community's response, and as you noted, social media has really changed everybody has their own soapbox, and all they need is just a little bit of following to generate that interest, which can then sway, you know, other people to see from their point of view. And that's not, you know, it's not to say it's right or wrong, but it does have an effect of, I really think that this is a unique profession where when one officer does something wrong, all the rest of us look bad. And that's something that we have to basically accept and own and just go, okay, if somebody does something wrong in California, it gets this bad press, gets this bad coverage, you know, it's going to look poorly upon me over here in Ohio. So how do we adjust with that? How do we feel about that? I think that's, you know, it can be challenging because, again, we all have emotions and things like that, and it can be unsettling, you know, to think that people don't trust me. I've never had any, you know, I've never been written up other than, you know, hitting a phone pole or something like that, but I've never been written up for my conduct with how I treat the community or how I treat the public. So to have somebody say to me, well, I don't trust you, well, you don't know me, but yet that is the stigma of this profession that can be, you know, kind of challenging to overcome, I think. So.
And from my perspective as a lawyer, people can say through the Bar Association to the Supreme Court Disciplinary Council, he didn't do the right thing, and then there's an investigation of my conduct. That takes time by definition, where certainly in the environment we have now, instant gratification, instant news.
Sure.
It doesn't take long for what you did to be examined, right or wrong. Is that fair?
Yes. Oh, sure. And that's where, you know, even with body camera footage and just with citizens using their cameras, as soon as that gets out there, you know, police chiefs are expected to have a response to this. And whether or not it's swift or, you know, people do like to have that swift response, but that's not always the best thing to have. You know, sometimes it is important to, you know, digest everything, look things over. That was the officer within their, you know, the policies, the parameters of what's expected of them. And then maybe it needs to be then, I guess, issued out to the public where we say, hey, well, this is where we saw this incident and how it falls in line with our policies. And again, if the officer's responding with how the policies written and how they're dictated, and the community does not like that, then that needs to be addressed. I think that needs to be addressed with the leadership in each agency. There's an Ohio Collaborative Group, which is it's in Ohio, obviously, but it's where retired police chiefs come up with these standards that like to have the police department's policies have specific standards that they meet, which I think is useful and it's important, because in different communities, we all have different policies. We might have a policy on how we, arrest a person. We might have a policy on how we're supposed to transport a person. Well, the other city next door to me might not have that. So what the Ohio Collaborative Group is doing is they're trying to create this standard that for our use of force policy, it has to meet these certain standards in order to be okayed through the Ohio Collaborative Group. Now, departments do not have to join this group. However, if you're not on there, then basically they put out the, hey, you're not in compliance with it. So I don't know if eventually maybe the Attorney General or the government might, start to take funding away or something like that, to where if you don't meet these just basic standards that are in these policies,
Yeah.
I think that would be, to bring people into compliance or bring departments into compliance, I think that would be very helpful, especially across the state. So we know that this is the policy and how it meets in Lakewood, and this is how it meets in Westlake, and their standards are matching. So if an officer uses too much force, we should be able to say, well, hey, what was the officer's response? Well, they should be able to look at that and basically be able to determine, was that officer within compliance? And I think even after the George Floyd incident with his death, there needs to be more of a transparent partnership between the community and the police department. The police department have, my department, we have a phone book of policies, that the community's not fully aware of and or fully understand why we do what we do, but we are trained to respond in a certain way. And if the community does not like how we responded to a certain thing, then they should be able to address that with the law enforcement administration, go, hey, we'd like to review this policy with you. And law enforcement leadership, at least me personally, should say, okay, come in, let's talk. So that way so when you do have a critical incident happens, after that critical incident, you have that dialogue that's already been connected with the community leaders and the law enforcement leadership, where they go, hey Trent, what happened? Hey Chief, what happened here? It doesn't look like your officer was in the right with what happened here.
Yes.
And since you have that open dialogue, that community leader can actually help you through this difficult situation.
Yeah.
I think that's a partnership that each community should be reaching out to.
So you've got 24 years in as a police officer?
Yes.
I'm sure there's an amazing amount of change
Sure.
that has taken place, but just on the issue of the public perception of the police, do you sense there's been tremendous change since you came on?
Yeah, that's my dissertation was on what police departments are doing to bring back interest to this profession. When I started with my city, there was anywhere from 400 to 600 people that sat to take this exam for. I think we hired 4 people off that list.
4 out of 400.
4 out of 400, yes. And then I took tests all over the state at that time. In the mid to late 90s, I was taking tests all over the state of Ohio. Cincinnati, Columbus, Toledo, Youngstown. I was taking tests anywhere, because I was at that point where I needed a job. Dad was it's time. We're getting a job. Let's go. So, and I knew that, and I wanted to. So I was taking all these tests, and again, it's a learning process. My first interview, I'll never forget, was at Marysville Police Department. It was the worst interview that you've ever seen or could have ever. I was 21 years old. I have no idea what they were going to ask me, and it was just really, really bad. But by the time I made it to my city now, where I was pretty confident with what they wanted to hear, how I needed to present myself, so I felt very confident. And now, if just to how society's viewing the police department, if we fast forward to last year, my agency gave a test, and we actually had 3 open positions, and we had 22 people take our entrance exam. 22 people. So
For 3 positions where you had 400 people taking it for 4.
yes.
And is the trend, is this brand new, or has it been
No,
that trend
sure.
being down since you came on?
It's been trending, and that's a lot of where I really credit the literature review I did for my doctorate, because going through this, I didn't really give the consideration of 9/11. So if we jump in the 1980s and 1990s, so we have this, community policing effort where police officers, we really want to connect with the community. We're doing all these different things. So we really build up this partnership with communities. And we go to 9/11. 9/11 happens. So the federal government, works together with local agencies to try to identify terrorist activities. We have these fusion centers that are created for police officers to send information to the federal government on possible terroristic activities, different things like this. So we went from 2 decades of building this relationship to now teaching our officers to look out for people in our community, start to question things in our community, and we started to erode that relationship that we had by questioning, different people about their motives. What do you know? What's going on in these different areas like this? So we really started to, I think, erode that relationship that we built. And then once we hit right around 2010, 2011, there started to be this shift, and it almost was with the social media and how much influence social media had, how a video could go out and it could really, you could give your opinion on it, many people could give their opinion on it, and it started to, grow legs, and it would just basically carry itself. And then we had the Michael Brown incident really was a turning point, I think, because it was right around 2012 to 2014, we really saw a significant decrease in that era. And then after 2014, I'd say we probably had maybe 40, and then it just continually going down.
And is this a situation other agencies have as well?
Yeah, this is across the country. This isn't just like a state thing or even a local thing. This is, police departments are struggling to get qualified candidates, so much so that they're debating on whether or not to lower certain standards. Like when we hire somebody, how long has it been since they've used some type of illegal drug? Do they have any theft offenses or any type of criminal records, any OVI? So we started to question these different types of standards and whether or not we should review them, to basically help to encourage people to come back to this profession. But, what I found through my dissertation really has been, a lot of departments are moving towards that lateral entry, where lateral entry is where an officer who works, for full time for a year or two at another agency can bypass that civil service exam and then go into another department. They'll still have to go through the background, but they get to skip over that civil service. And what I found through the research, and I talked to 10 different police chiefs or recruitment officers in the greater Cleveland area, Cuyahoga County, just to find out what they're doing in a response to basically this decreased. And there was one that actually they didn't have any decrease, but they've always had a standard where the person has to have OPATA certification, the state certification to be a police officer. So they were kind of my outlier. The other ones were, a lot of them are shifting towards that lateral entry, thinking that they might be able to fill those gaps in the agencies and what they're, which they're so short. And I don't, from what I'm looking at, from just viewing it, looking, evaluating everything, it's going to end up being who has the better police department, I think, or who pays more. And there really has to be some type of connection that a local agency can make to grab that officer and bring him in. Like when I was hired up here, I was also a candidate for a township down by Cincinnati. Same pay, relatively the same benefits, but the city up here gave me that opportunity. And I felt almost an allegiance to this department. And I don't think that we've maintained that retention, that type of connection anymore, like what we used to have. Like there's the officers now that they feel the same way, that older generation. And then you start to evaluate, is it a generational thing? Because leadership, you have to be able to adjust your leadership to who you're leading. A Generation X, a millennial, they all respond to different things in different ways. So you have to be able to adjust to that. And you really have to grab somebody, and like if you get them hired, you have to retain them. You got to keep them here. How do you do that?
Well, you mentioned the word OPATA. What does OPATA stand for? Ohio something.
Ohio Peace Officers Training Academy. So.
And where is that?
Well, the main one's down in London, Ohio.
Okay.
But each county has a training center. Most counties have a training center. Like Tri-C has an OPATA training center. LCC has a training center. So that's just where they go, and I believe it's the 26 weeks, 24 or 26 weeks training that the officers receive before they get their certification.
And has that training changed since you came on?
Yes, yeah, there's been a shift in that has been towards the de-escalation, which is the crisis intervention training, which basically deals with somebody who's in crisis. Most times when people call the police, it's not to say hello, how are you, things like that. Something traumatic's going on in their life. They need help. So when we get there, we have to tend to the situation, but in such a way that we're not come across as like the aggressor. We have to be a more of a anchor to the person and helping them through a situation.
Yeah.
And these new guys that have come onto the agency have really, they've been through that either 40 or 80 hours of advanced training on how to de-escalate a situation safely, and just even looking past that call, for somebody who's in trouble, things like that. So I think that's where we have the younger officers are better trained than the older officers. Like me, we didn't have that type of training.
So when a person passes the bar exam, the results came out just last week, it takes quite a while to call yourself an effective lawyer, I think. Law school can only prepare you for so much, and then you get into the real world.
Mm-hmm.
Is it fair to state that there's a beyond training time before an officer can be considered a really, really good police officer?
I think each person's different. Some people, when I came up here, I came from a small village where there's 2,000 people. I worked by myself. The county was my backup. So if there was a fight in town, my backup could be 25 minutes away going lights and sirens coming across Champaign County. So when I came up here, I had more of that stability where I had more of a confidence in myself when I knew that if something were to happen, I'd be able to handle myself. But now we're bringing in new people into a situation where maybe they're not a police officer before, but they come into this situation and they're presented with somebody who's very aggressive, and they don't know when that exact time when to pull the switch to make the arrest. You will try to de-escalate a situation. You'll try your verbal judo to bring a person down and to slow them down so that we can manage what's going on. But there comes a point in time where you have to take control of the situation. And I think younger officers, they struggle with knowing when's the time to say, hey,
Yeah.
it's time to go. We got to make an arrest here. We're not accomplishing anything. So, and I think that's hard for somebody to grasp, especially if they've had no experience. So that's where that field training program comes in.
What is field training program?
So each officer that's hired will go through, normally it's 16 weeks of training, anywhere from 14 to 16 weeks of training, where they will ride with an officer on different shifts, normally 3 or 4 weeks at a time, just so they have an understanding of how do they approach the different paperwork, all the different paperwork, how to complete it, and then also how to conduct themselves. And sometimes people catch on quicker than others, but there's a 2-year basically probationary time where each agency can say, hey, this officer's not working out. So once they're out on their own, they can, the department can say, hey, this person's been out, we had to put them back in the FTO, they're not going to make it, or they're not progressing as they should. The department can basically remove them from the agency. They can basically fire them for not meeting those standards. But
Let's go backwards for a second. When a candidate passes the civil service test, is there a minimum score they have to pass it by, first of all?
it's either 70 or 75.
So let's say out of those 22, let's say all 22 of them are 78. They're all somewhat equal, but they passed the exam. What happens next to those candidates?
They then go through a background examination.
It's a criminal background?
Criminal background investigation. So they will fill out a packet about where they're from, the different jobs they've had, references, their financial status, any type of illegal drugs they've used, any type of criminal activity. We'll fingerprint them, and then we'll hand them off to our background investigators. The background investigator will set them up for a polygraph, which is, a lot of times they'll do the polygraphs early on, because a lot of times they'll get a lot more information out of the person as they come into the polygraph. The polygraph examiner has a set set form of questions that they give the person ahead of time. They come in, you know, they give them the responses, and then it's basically almost like an interview like this, where you have a casual conversation about, you know, have you had any theft offenses that you haven't been caught with? You know, is there different things you've had in your past? Do you have you know, abusive towards your spouse, anything like that? So they'll go through all these questions, and then they'll put them on the polygraph. And the polygraph will, you know, he'll be able to work through different things, and he'll say, hey, he or she will say, hey, you showed a response that wasn't within the parameters on the theft offense. Did something pop into your head? And a lot of times when you're going through this, if it's somebody who, at least what I've had from my experience, I was the voice stress analyzer, which is similar to polygraph, but when they have those things that pop on them, they know what they're thinking about going into it. And that's what you want the person to do.
Yeah.
Because you actually read them the questions. These are the questions I'm going to read you before I'm going to read them to you. And when you read them, so that way they know, you know, we'll have 10 other questions, but you're only thinking about the theft offense that's coming in about, you know, it's coming up here, and I know it's getting close, and you can see the
heartbeat goes up and everything.
And then it'll spike. So it's actually pretty neat to watch. And then afterward, he or she will finish out the questions, and they'll say, hey, you know, you showed an elevated whatever on the theft question. Did something pop into your head? Just simply, and you go, well, you know, there was this time back in college when I took these pens, it just popped in my head. Okay. Then you go back through it again, and you go through the same questions again.
Wow.
So, but you learn a lot about that person, and or the background investigators do. And that's where you really need to have the background investigators. It gives them almost like a springboard off into what we need to look at. Okay, so they might have said they had an issue at their old department or with one of their jobs, so we're going to go talk to those. So you really start to build this kind of profile on a person, and you're trying to see if they're going to mesh with your department. Not every department's different. Some are more militaristic, where they're very, you know, they have uniform inspection, the beginning of ending of each, you know, roll call. You have these different things, and you have other ones that are a little more relaxed in terms of how their beginnings are, or how they start out. So with those different types of things, you want to make sure this person's going to mesh well with your department. And then I think the biggest thing is the honesty thing, at least for me. And we were talking about divvying or reducing or changing the standards. I think the public should be involved with that decision making, because police we have guns. We're the only person that can come and take away your freedom. I can put handcuffs on you and remove you from the streets. We want to make sure we have the right people in this profession. And if we start to change these standards, I think the community should say, hey, I don't think we should have somebody who has a domestic violence or who's stolen a bunch of money, or who maybe has, you know, they've had this issue with their spouse in the past, even though they were never charged. They have these issues. So what do we want to, so involving the community, and that's where I found a lot of agencies are trying to do, is involve the community in these types of things, so it brings them closer to the department, where they feel like, because the police should be working for the community. It's kind of, it really should be like that, and it should be a partnership, especially right now with the image of the police. It should be that partnership.
I think the word might be confidence. So that whether it's a traffic stop, or an officer coming to your home, or even an officer calling you on the phone, you want to have confidence that that's the best public servant he can be, or she can be.
Yes.
And so how do we get there, again, during the hiring process, on a psychological level? Is there a psychological evaluation of the person
There
as
is.
well?
Yes, so we will go through, and I believe it's after the conditional offer, the person will go take the psychological test.
There's a test,
Yes, so it's
a uniform test.
Yes, and I think it's like either 900 or 1,000 questions they go through.
Wow.
And basically, a lot of them are similar questions, and they will, you know, how you answer them in different, you know, you might see the same question just worded a little bit differently about 100 questions in, and you'll start to get tired. And the whole point of it is, so when you get tired, because you're answering all these questions, is that you're going to start to relax, and you're going to start to just answer how you would think and how you feel. And that's because you don't want to think, well, they asked me if I stole something that was valued between $10 and $20. And then they asked me later on, did I steal something that's valued between $12 and $16? And so you start, and they tell you that before you go in, so you know, just answer truthfully.
Yeah.
That's what we want to know.
Yeah,
And so it really it builds that profile as to whether or not that person's going to be trustworthy. And again, I think that's really what that probationary period, that 2 years, really needs to be an evaluation of the person. Like, you need to have a person in charge of that field training program that is constantly monitoring how this person's doing. Are they meeting those guidelines? Are they meeting the checks? And if they're not, is there something we can do to bring them up to speed? Or do we need to just say, this isn't working out?
What is the appropriate level of coordination between someone coming from the military service and to becoming a police officer? Is it an easy switch from one to the next? That's the two questions. Is it common that a lot of officers come from the military background?
Yes, yeah. A lot of, I'd say probably 50 to 60% come from military. So
Is that right?
Yeah. And then there's more departments too that are also going towards education, where you have
I was
to have
just
a
going to
full-
ask that question, yeah.
So there's two
Yeah.
different variables to kind of take from, where there's been some studies that say the education, the 4-year education helps an officer with their de-escalation skills, because they're, and then you have the military side where they're, they will do what you tell them to do. They're order driven, and they will stay within those parameters. So they will not, venture outside that. So they are very well put together as well. So it's kind of a balancing of almost two of them. But I know that the military, that when they're getting ready to exit the military, they'll go through I'm not exactly sure how long the training is, but it's almost like where you're going to go back to civilian life, so they'll go through some type of training. And there's been a lot of that where we've actually talked about recruiting at that location as well, when they're starting to come out of the military.
So during the process of deciding we need more officers, whether there's retirements or the funding, city council says you can hire 5 more officers. How long is the process from we can hire someone till they're alone in a police car by themselves?
Well, normally, if they said that you can hire somebody as fast as you can, it would probably be the background investigation, the polygraph, and then you have the psychological, you have the medical. You have a panel interview where they have 6 people from the department
Wow.
sit down and grill you with, what would you do in this scenario? How would you present yourself with this? And then I'd say that process you might be able to expedite and get done in maybe a month and a half to 2 months. And that's if you have a working list. Like, our department just put out we're actually hiring. We're going to be hiring, I think we can hire 2 right now. So that's going to be, I think our test is in June, and we just got to put it out this week that, hey, we are hiring. So it'll be June, then by the time they take the test, the testing company certifies the list, sends it back to civil service. Civil service
Wow.
gets it. They have to have a meeting that says, hey, yes, this is okay to use. You're probably talking, it'll probably be 2 to 3 months before we could say, hey, this person's hired. So we're at May, so maybe July. And then by the time that person completes their FTO program, that's 14 weeks later. So you're looking at probably October. to
Almost
November.
January 1st.
Yeah, if you're comfortable with them sending them out
Yeah.
at that point, yeah.
So what are the what are the economics of this? In other words, are there some municipal police departments that are undermanned solely because of the economics that we live in, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think with the pandemic, I think a lot of departments adjusted their approach. My department did the same thing, where we're not actually going out to, at that time, we didn't go out to calls. If we could handle it over the phone, we handled it over the phone. I think over about the past 4 or 5 months, we started to shift that back out to where, and that's, again, where we don't have that community contact during that time, so that could also basically help us or probably hindered us from getting people to come out for this position, because you don't see cops out, they're not responding to calls because of COVID, so they really lost, again, that connection. So I'm sure there'll be studies down the line about how much that probably affected the police and because they've lost that connection again.
Changing the subject just to move on, again, staying in training, what type of service revolver do you carry with you? I assume you don't have it on now, do you?
No,
What type of service revolver do you get when you come on your department?
a 9mm.
And what does that mean to the layman like me?
It's a 6-hour 9mm. It's just it's a handgun. It's a semi-automatic. I think it holds 12 rounds. And that's what I get. And then there's a backup gun we also get as well.
So that 9mm, how does that leave you if you're alone on a call with a really bad guy with weaponry that we see? Do you have the advantage, or do they have better guns than you? Is that a fair question? And then what is the answer?
I think that's, I mean, I don't know if it's a fair question. I mean, the general public and things like that, I mean, obviously we have guns in the car. We have assault rifles in the car.
You do?
We have shotguns in the car. So if there's,
Okay.
So if we need to expedite things like that, but, to me, it's all about, I don't think we're ever going to get all the guns off the street. That'll never happen with the amount of guns that are out there. So I think a better approach is basically training our guys to know, and gals to know how to handle a situation. Like if somebody has in that particular time, if somebody has a gun and they're pointing at you, it doesn't matter what type of gun I have. Our vests are rated to handle my gun. So if my gun gets taken away from me, I get shot with my gun. My vest is rated to help me, save me, because
Wow.
it's rated from my gun. So.
And weapons training itself, do you get that as part of OPATA?
Yeah. So you have to go through taser training. Like I said, taser's really changed how we interact with people, and it's obviously reduced the number of injuries. When I started, not many departments had the taser, so you're hands-on. Use your pepper spray. I've been pepper sprayed more times than I've ever pepper sprayed somebody else, because the other officer pepper spraying, just everybody gets pepper sprayed. Whereas now you have the taser. The tasers, you have the laser, and you can shoot 2 different people with it. It's an amazing tool. And but yeah, at OPATA, you have, I think it was a week and a half or 2 weeks of revolver, or not revolver, but you learn how to shoot a gun. If you don't pass that course, then they had I know somebody at LCC or one of the academies that didn't pass the gun on the range for the academy. I think it was like halfway through the academy, they were bounced from the academy. So they have to
Wow.
meet those standards, and then each year you have to recertify with your department. So we go through training where we shoot our main guns, our backup guns, and then the guns that are in the car. We have to qualify with those as
And
well.
what happens if an 18-year officer doesn't pass that year's gun
Then
testing?
They will lose their commission. Like it's that.
Wow.
You have to meet these standards. So, and if you don't meet these standards, then you're removed. And like each year, like this year, OPATA, they put out, I think we have to have 24 hours of continued professional training, and they will mandate that each officer who has a certification has to complete these 24 hours of training, which is domestic violence, use of force, sex trafficking. There's different things that they pick each year.
Mm-hmm.
And it was supposed to be for, like when we got casinos, they had all this, some of the tax money was supposed to go towards police training. And so it's kind of sporadic. It kind of, we had mandated training 2 or 3 years ago, and then we didn't have anything for 2 or 3
Correct.
years, and then we have it again this year. So, but I mean, they pay for that training for us to go to this training.
Emergency situations, you can't learn everything ahead of time.
No.
Is there training and an ongoing training in how to handle an emergency situation, whether it be somebody with a gun or somebody in medical crisis? I know there's multiple questions there. How does an officer get trained? Let's go to medical training.
Mm-hmm.
You come upon the scene and you have an epileptic attack, or you have somebody with a diabetic attack.
Sure.
Is there an element of training in how to approach and analyze those two particular situations?
A lot of those fall back onto your field training officer and how they would handle it.
Okay.
But every officer is CPR certified, the AED certification. There's been calls where I've responded with the fire department because we have 2 main squads, and if they're tied up, they'll have like somebody come from a neighboring city, so they'll have to call for mutual aid. So I've gone and done CPR on people while you're waiting for the other squad to show up. So, and again, it can be adrenaline. That adrenaline kicks in, and that's where every officer has to fall back on their training. How were you trained? And if they had good training, they're going to respond in such a way that they're not even going to think about it. So if somebody comes at me and they pull out a gun, it should be instantaneous of my reaction. And that's what you want. You want the officer to be able to look at a situation, evaluate the situation, and go, okay, I need to respond in this way. And if I don't respond in this way, I might not go home to my family. So I have to be able to visualize, is that a gun? Is it dark out? Am I sure it's a gun? Is the person pointing? I'm evaluating all these things in 2 to 3 seconds, and probably quicker if I think it's a gun. And there's no de-escalating at that point. And that's where you have to be able to, you don't want your officers to second guess themselves. If it's a gun, it's a gun, and the person's pointing at you, you have to evaluate that quickly and rely on your training to respond in such a way that you're gonna go home. Don't, if it's pointed at you, we're not trained to shoot people in the leg. That's not what we do. If I shoot you in your leg and it goes between your legs and skips off the ground and hits somebody back behind you, officers are trained to shoot at center mass, because that's your biggest target is right here. And that's just what they're trained to shoot. They're not trained to do trick shots or things like that. You're in a high intense adrenaline pumping situation.
Mm-hmm.
You want the officer to react and shoot like that. They're not going to shoot the gun out of their hand or shoot them in the leg or anything like that.
Medical emergencies.
Mm-hmm.
When you started, there were no such thing as Narcan. Or
Correct.
it wasn't being used. How much training in there is there? Let's just stick with that one issue, not the socialization of narcotics and illicit narcotics. But let's just stick with an issue as simple as Narcan. What is Narcan?
So Narcan's it's an anti-opioid medication.
Okay.
That is sprayed into the nose of somebody who's overdosing. So if you come upon a scene, a lot of times people will come across either a loved one that's passed out or very shallow breathing. So they're not dead, but they're overdosing where their heart rate is slowing down to such a point that they are, basically they could die relatively quickly.
Okay.
So our officers have been trained we got trained through Southwest Hospital. They came out and they trained us on it, and there was a county program through Cuyahoga County that sent out these Narcan units to each of the officers. And so we were all trained on how to use them. And so when an officer responds, because a lot of times we'll get there well before the squad
Sure.
does, because the squad's got to, they got to get out of bed or, stop eating breakfast and get in their squads and come. But I'm just kidding. So they got to go get in their squads, so they'll send us first because they know that we'll get there sooner. So we get there.
Because you're already in the
Because
zone.
we're already out. Each officer's assigned to
Yeah.
a certain area.
A
So
certain zone, right.
the officers will get there quickly, and they'll go in, they'll take in their Narcan kit, and it's basically as simple as you unzip the pouch, you put you put your gloves on, you just put a little, like, ampule into this thing, into basically a syringe, and you just shoot up into the nostril of the person. And sometimes if they use like a lot of drugs, and then you might have to use more than one dose of that Narcan to bring them out of it. And it's an amazing drug to see somebody who's shallow breathing to then all of a sudden just waking up and just sitting up and looking at you like,
Where have I been?
what just happened? Why are you standing here?
Yeah,
What's
right in
going
front
on?"
of you.
Yeah, and it's an amazing thing to watch.
And it happens a lot of times in front of family members
Yes.
who don't have who are obviously very scared about someone going to pass
Oh, sure.
away, and all of a sudden you're bringing them back by what could be numerous cans of Narcan.
Yes. Yeah.
Let's change the subject for a minute, since we're not quite short of time, but let's talk about a few other things. Carry concealed laws. What is a carry concealed law?
So that's where you take these classes that basically allow for you to carry a concealed weapon. So it's basically on you, it's hidden, it's not visible to the public. We are an open carry state, so you and I could walk down the street with a gun on our hip, visible to everybody. We could have our AR-15s just walking down the street, and that's just how it is. We're an open carry, so people can see that person has a gun. If you wanted to conceal carry, you can take these classes, then you get, basically the sheriff will give you a card that says you're allowed to basically conceal your weapon so nobody can see it.
And the new law says you don't have to go to those classes anymore, and there
Correct.
won't be a certification or even a listing of who has the permit. Everybody will be able to do it.
Yes.
What's the effect upon the police department?
Well, I think that's almost not to speak out of turn for every police department, but it's when to go through those classes taught people to have how to use a gun. As we indicated, we took 2 weeks of training at OPATA. You learn about the safety of your gun, how to take your gun apart, put your gun back together. So now I understand my gun, and now I have to go down to the range and I have to learn to shoot from 50 feet away and hit this target, you know, to where now we could go get a gun and we can just go carry it. You know, it's kind of removed that need for training, or that I think it would be obviously helpful for a person to have training, you know, to even have that gun, but we've, you know, so I think police, I guess I'm apprehensive about it, to be honest with you, because, again, it would pop up on our computers. So we have computers in the car, so we run your license plate. When we pull you over, it would pop up, say this person has a concealed carry. So we know.
So you got it. It's in
So
your
we know.
head.
It's in our head. So we go up, and in 99.999% of people, you go up, you know, hands are right on the steering wheel, go, I'm armed, I have a CCW, it's in the glove box. The officer go, okay, great, thanks. Can I get your driver's license, proof of insurance? Again, it's a matter of safety. And now we've kind of removed that to where if an officer sees a gun in the car, how's that officer going to respond? You know, and they're like, well, I don't have to have a concealed carry. I can just carry my gun in my
Yeah.
car. So now we've changed the dynamic, and I don't know if we've had, I guess, the proper training to basically help our officers, you know, when they do have to interact with this. So
Yeah.
what are we going to do? That probably has to fall back on our prosecutor to do something to write up some type of paperwork so we have an understanding of what those laws
Thanks a
are.
lot.
So, yeah, you're welcome.
Next subject,
Yes, sir.
unions, discipline, evaluation of conduct. Certainly since 2014 and before that, there's been a public analysis of how that process works. And there's been a public discord suggesting that that process has not worked very well. And I think Minneapolis is a pretty easy way to determine whether it works well or not. How does the system work from a patrolman side of the story?
Well, I understand the union. So the union's going to protect the union who pays the dues. And it's the same as if you get an attorney. So if I get an attorney, I'm going to pay this attorney to represent me. And this representation is going to be, even if I'm wrong, my attorney's going to say he was right with what he did. So I guess in that regard, I can understand, you know, when you have a union that's supporting somebody that's so visibly and outrageous, like the George Floyd incident. There should be no justification for any of that. And I think that's really where I think the union, or even like the head, you know, the national union, should be able to step in and go, we're hands off on this one. But they're not going to do that because of the dynamics of everything. Then they'll feel like, so again, that's kind of it's a great question that I don't have a super great answer to. But I think it's one that probably will need to be addressed. And I think if that is addressed, I think maybe that would help with the connection between the police and the community, where they don't feel like, well, the police officer can do whatever he wants and he can just get away with it. Whereas when they do have like a policy violation, or what the community feels should be a policy violation, I think that's where the community should have some type of route to be able to approach the police chief or whoever the chief decides to put in charge of community relations, to be able to have that discussion and go, the community doesn't like how this is going with this particular one. This should be addressed. So, okay, well, let's address it together. And I think that really should be a focal point moving forward with how to, I guess, move forward, just to kind of, I guess, re-engage the community.
Many people, a traffic stop is their only lifelong connection to a police officer. Some people are uncomfortable now just with the concept of being stopped by a police officer, regardless of we're talking traffic, regardless of their traffic conduct, they're uncomfortable with being stopped and questioned by a police officer. How do you react to that?
Well, I guess that's I can understand it to some extent. However, with body cameras, I think body cameras should be a national mandate. Like, we got our body cameras through a grant. We paid very little money, and that was the federal government basically helping us to get these body cameras. So every department should have these body cameras.
And where are they?
Mine's positioned in my pocket, so it just sits right on my pocket.
Is it on all the time?
It's only on when I flip my lights on, it automatically turns on. It turns on my body camera, it turns on the car camera inside the car.
So the lights, so you have to be involved, not just driving down the roadway.
No.
Okay, so the overhead, whatever the
It'll-
lights are,
So as soon as I turn it on, the in-car camera jumps back 30 seconds. So it's continually recording. So it'll actually go back and it'll capture 30 seconds before that officer turned on his
Okay.
overhead lights. So then, and it also initiates your body camera. That does not go back 30 seconds. It initiates it right then and there.
okay?
So then it's recording, and it's recording until the officer hits stop. So during that entire traffic stop, it'll be on camera. The interaction between the citizen and the officer should be recorded. And I encourage people to record, if they want to have their own recording, that's fine as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
I mean, that doesn't bother me at all, and it shouldn't bother any officer either, because we shouldn't be doing anything that where we go, oh, you can't have that on right now.
Yeah,
There should be none of that.
Is there apprehension on traffic stops from people that that I could safely call race-related issues? There is always questioning, I think, upon what percentage of stops are for minorities.
Mm-hmm.
Do the officers in your department face that?
I think any officer, they could, just on a daily basis of the amount of people that you stop. And with my agency, we have two major highways that crisscross through our community. So we have and the airport's right close to us. So we deal with all different types of races and people. And you will occasionally have somebody that'll call out, that's the reason why you stopped me. But that's where you have to rely on your technology and what's recorded here and how it appears on that recording when it gets to court. And the person has the same opportunity to take the ticket to court, to have it, thrown out of court if it's deemed not justified stop.
But it seems like the whole legal system, by definition, begins with an officer deciding to turn on those lights.
Mm-hmm. It does.
Yeah.
And there's an officer discretion. Like I could drive down the street and there could be, 10 cars in front of me all going 15 miles over the speed limit. How do I decide which one I'm going to stop?
Yeah,
So, and that is it's a fair question.
yeah.
Why do I decide to stop this one person and not the other person? To me, I've always looked at it, especially like on the highway when you're running laser, it's always the first car in front. Like you might have like 4 cars behind them, like going the same speed. It's like the car that's up front. But you have to, and that's what you really have to instill in those new officers, is that there can be no pre-thought to why I'm stopping this car other than for that violation. And if you have officers that are thinking that, that's where that connection between the community is really going to break down, because they're going to know it. I mean, if you, again, we have to state whether or not the race of, or I'm sorry, we have to state the race of the person that we stopped. Even if we give them a warning, we keep track of that. So that's a measurable standard that somebody can come back and evaluate. And that's part of the Ohio Collaborative Group, is that they wanted us to instill that
Yeah.
into our CAD system, so that the officer will call out, they'll give out the race, and dispatch will put that in there. So that if somebody down the line wants to say, hey, why did your agency, what's the race breakdown of the agency of people who got tickets and people who
Yes.
got warnings, they can simply do an evaluation of that.
Wow.
We can generate a report with that.
So, 2 other issues. One is family violence, domestic violence, mother, son, father, daughter, boyfriend, girlfriend, my parents of a baby. How difficult are those situations for you coming on the scene with just a call saying, go to this house, something's up? How difficult are those calls for you?
I think a lot of those are, especially, having a family at home, you're going to come across situations that are similar in terms of like the makeup of your home. So like I've had issues, like, or not issues, but where, I've gone to a call where a kid's been deceased, and it was a 6-month-old kid, and I had a 9-month-old kid at home. So it really it rattles you. And I think, my wife has been a rock for me. Like I come home and I talk to her about everything. And she just listens. She knows, and I think that's one of the biggest things that officers need to learn early on, is to find a support person. And just somebody you can talk to they'll listen to you, they'll tell you, gives you some, this is what you need to do. And it is hard. Mentally, it can be hard when you see a kid, during a domestic violence situation, or a battered spouse, and you're trying to help them and they don't want that help, or
Yeah.
it can be very challenging. And it can be frustrating.
The issue of bail. Bail in Ohio, from the Ohio Supreme Court standpoint and from the Ohio Revised Code standpoint, is if you are arrested, you're going to be able to go home, but for very few offenses. What pressure does that put upon the police department to think we made the arrest, they're going to go home right away sometimes? How does that affect your ability to do your job?
It can be frustrating, they you joke around about, they get out before I'm even done with my report, my paperwork, things like that. But it can be a frustrating thing where you're doing what what you're supposed to do. This is what the legislator has told me I need to do to enforce the law. Is the court doing their part? I don't know. So it can be very frustrating. It can be very, I guess, overall psyche of it. It's like, okay, well, this person's going to get right back out, and they did what? And you kind of go, but again, it's not something that, and I think recognizing that we can't change it, that it has to come from the legislator, has to come through the court system, it has to come from somebody else. And that's where, people in the community might feel that there's some specific law that might not be, you shouldn't be able to pull over a car for having a license plate light out, but that's on the book. Like, that's where, and you go, yeah, I understand, but again, talk to your legislator. And it can be very challenging. And again, I understand some laws, I won't say that they seem petty, but at the same time, you look at some certain things and you kind of go, well, maybe this is something that the legislator should evaluate and basically remove from the books, because maybe it's not something that needs to be pertinent. Maybe there should be some type of judicial review on some of these certain things. So,
DWIs. How much time does it take for a police officer from the moment somebody's pulled over until that officer's done with that case? How many hours could that take?
it could easily take 3 to 4 hours. Because
Wow.
you're doing the field sobriety tests, you're going through the different field sobriety tests, all these different steps, and then you get back and there's a ton of paperwork that you have to do. There's the BAC machine, the intoxilizer machine, you have to write your report. And the reports now, I know with the, because they've become more strict in terms of how you're supposed to do your field sobriety test. So what the officer will do, they will actually take their time in writing those reports, because again, your defense attorney will look at that and go, well, did the person have heels on? Did you afford them the opportunity to take off their shoes? So you have to be aware of all these different variables, as you're writing this report, knowing that if you get to a suppression hearing, they could very simply just throw out your case or throw out your stop or throw out that one test because you didn't ask them, would you like to take off your shoes because you have a 2-inch heel on?
And on that particular issue, when I was first a prosecutor in 1984, I remember officers telling me even then, our job is to take the drunk driver off the road. If the judge declares it wasn't a good stop, or that you want to reduce it, or something happens other than a guilty, I still feel like I've done my job. I made the community safer. I got the person off the road. Is that a fair thing for an officer to think?
As long as they did it, along the law, within the law. They had to have probable cause to make that stop. Just because that guy might be, you have to have that, But yeah, to me, if I make that stop, I go up and, when I was on the road, I would always do the HGN, like where you're testing the person's eyes. I would
Right.
test them and while they're sitting in the car. And if they have 6 points in that, just sitting in the car, they're drunk. I'm going to bring them out. I'm going to put them through the other tests as well.
Yeah.
However, if you have 6 points on those eyes, the eyes are the gateway to your soul. You're drunk. And if they did flying colors on the walk and turn, I'm still going to take them to jail because they're impaired. And I know that they're impaired. And if they're, and it's better to be safe than sorry. And again, I have the justification and the probable cause to arrest this person, I'll arrest them.
Yeah. Have you been on the scene of, we've come on the scene and there's been somebody deceased in your time as a police officer?
Yeah.
How do you react to that, whether it's a young person or just someone who passed in their sleep at night? This is a two-part question. How do you deal with that on the scene? And then how long does that stick with you?
So everybody I've learned from this is everybody is different with how they view a deceased person. A lot of times, for me, I'm more of I take emotions from other people. So if there's somebody there that is, crying, they're very upset, I would be more inclined to be a little bit more upset. Whereas if, I don't know if it's because of the era I was brought in, but, you're taught to be this tough officer, you have this hard shell on you, and nothing affects you. And I think even to this day, I still have that kind of that same view of, but of like a person who's maybe they've overdosed or something's happened with them. But you always have to be able to turn that switch on when you get to somebody who's had a loved one who's just passed right in front of them.
Yeah.
And like we go to all deceased bodies in our city. So if it's an 88-year-old person, so you might have just got done with a bar fight. You're throwing people around, you get all the, you got punched in the face and you get sent to this next call, and this lady's just lost her husband. You turn it off. You turn into an emotional person, and you're there to support that person.
Wow.
And those are probably the most taxing. And that's, like I said, I feed off of that. I just know from myself, I feed off of that emotion. And those can be hard. Those can be really gut-wrenching.
So all these years and all these things you've talked about, even in this hour, are you confident that things can stay okay, that you're going to be able to support a certain size officers, but the number of police officers, and that they're good officers coming? Are you confident about your profession?
I am, but there has to be a change in I guess, in how leadership takes this approach. Leadership has got to be in line with what they expect their officers to do. They have to have a clear mission, a clear goal on the direction that this department needs to take, and then they also need to connect with that community. Recruiting shouldn't happen as soon as that test comes out. Every officer that goes to a scene should be recruiting. If you go to a scene as a domestic, you should be in your head going, the way I treat Peter in this situation could affect, somebody else deciding to become a police officer. So if I arrest you and I'm a jerk to you, I'm like, oh, how can you do it? And I'm mean to you, so then you get home and your nephew was thinking about becoming a police officer. Like, don't become a police officer. This is how the officer treated me. All cops are bad. He's like, oh, Uncle P doesn't think I should be a cop. I'm not going to be. So it has a domino effect. And that's where, so leadership needs to have training on how they expect their officers to act. The officers should never get to the point to where they're screaming at a person. If it's plain and simple, if you need to make an arrest, it's nothing personal. I'm a public servant. I've had people tell me that they're going to come kill my dog, my kids.
Oh my God.
But you don't take it personal. This is my job. I'm not going to lose my cool and end up losing my job and helping. My job is, so that's what I want to teach my officers. When you are dealing with people, think of it as a recruitment. Would you want your job, or would you want your kid to come work for this department because of how this officer treated me? And that's really what has to happen. But having that right person lead you down that path, I think is the important thing. Having vision well outside of just 1 week or just leading up to this, like our test in 2 months. We needed to have like constant recruiting. Just, hey, how your school resource officers need to be going to the high school,
Yeah.
like the military officers do, and recruiting at lunchtime. We should be doing the same thing.
Wow.
So we really need to change our approach. And so I think if we change our approach, it'll start to climb. I think we're in a pretty deep hole, but we'll get there.
Well, it's been a wonderful time talking with you, Officer
Thank you.
Dr. Brown. I really appreciate your information and your truthful answers.
Sure.
Thank you all for attending and watching. This is the final of our sessions through season 2, as Deb Gerard, Justin Morse, Ed Rand, and Luis Fernandez call it. We will hopefully be back in the fall with a Tuesday lineup that you'll appreciate. Have a great summer, everyone. Thank you very much.